The dynasty market is a funny thing. Sometimes we just accept that a player has a certain amount of value without ever stopping to question what goes into that equation, whether it's rational or whether we're just wrapped up in recency bias or groupthink or whatever else. So I've been trying to ask those questions. I've been trying to nitpick player values to see if I could uncover some inefficiencies in the market that I haven't already talked about in videos this offseason. And I landed on some interesting players and a concept for today's video that I really like. I think the Dynasty domain guys did something like this a while ago, so shout out to them. But what I'm going to be doing is highlighting players that I believe are undervalued by comparing them to more expensive assets, more expensive players on the market. Essentially saying, at cost, I want this guy instead of that guy. So we're going to get right into our first comparison here. But before we do, if you enjoyed today's video, make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, leave a comment. All that stuff really helps me out, helps the channel grow. So please go ahead and consider doing that. But we're going to talk right now about a massive gap in dynasty value between two older running backs, two guys that have given us incredible production throughout their careers, Saquon Barkley and Christian McCaffrey. These two backs are pretty far apart in value right now. And the reference I'm going to be using, by the way, is fantasycalc.com. That's just an online ranking system that pulls trades from real sleeper leagues and uses that to calculate a value for each player. So over there on Fantasy Calc, Barkley sits at 22nd overall. McCaffrey's all the way down at 49th overall. So RB4 versus RB11. Obviously, I understand the market's reasoning for this gap in value to a certain extent. Saquon Barkley just rushed for 2,000 yards. McCaffrey spent most of the season sitting on the sidelines or flying to Europe for experimental Achilles procedures. So I get that. But you look at the Fantasy Calc trade calculator, which is obviously, no calculator is a perfect tool. It doesn't replicate exactly what you'll see in every league. But this tool, it thinks that Barkley for McCaffrey in a first is a fair trade. To me, I think this is insane. I think the gap between these two backs needs to be a lot smaller. And let me explain why. Starting with their age, Christian McCaffrey's 29.1 years old, Barkley's 28.4. Okay, they're less than a year apart in age. They came out in back-to-back draft classes. So as far as age-related concerns, production decline concerns, I think they're on fairly similar footing there. You can say Saquon's the more freaky athlete. Maybe he'll age better like a Derrick Henry. But for me, the age is a minimal difference for these two. The injury history obviously is in favor of Barkley. But I do think that we've kind of buried a bit of the Barkley injury history because he was healthy last year, because he was so good last year. If you look back through his NFL career, he had a high ankle sprain in 2019, tore his ACL in 2020, missed the start of the 21 season with that ACL tear, then suffered a low ankle sprain, had another ankle injury in 2023 that cost him 3 games. He hasn't really been the picture of health either throughout his career. There was even a time after that ACL tear, after the ankle sprain, where I remember people calling him injury prone and saying he was never going to be able to stay on the field. McCaffrey, on the other hand, he has missed more time throughout his career. He's had a few more big injuries. He's never had the ACL tear or anything like that, but he did miss basically all of last season with the Achilles tendonitis and then the PCL injury. And those two things were, as I understand it, totally disconnected. It was kind of like a freak combination of two things. But in 2023, he only missed week 18. I think he might have been able to play in that game, but I don't know if it mattered for the 49ers. Either way, he came back for the playoffs and played 3 more games. So he appeared in all but 1 game that season, didn't even hit the injury report a single time in 2022. Yeah, I know back in 21 and 2020, he had some injuries. My point here isn't to say that the injuries don't matter or that we shouldn't consider them or that they're at equal odds. I think McCaffrey is more likely to get injured than Saquon Barkley. I think pretty much any of the Twitter doctors or whoever you'd go to would say that. But I think the market views that difference as if McCaffrey has like 100% chance to miss games and Barkley has a 0% chance. That's really how it feels when people talk about these two players. In reality, McCaffrey's probably like 10% more likely to miss games, and we don't even know how many games that would be. Like, Barkley is not a totally safe investment. He's coming off over 400 touches at 28 years old. He is also an injury risk at running back. And obviously that's not even factoring in the Madden curse, which to be clear, I don't believe in the Madden curse, but I think either one of these guys can get hurt. And I do think we're ignoring the most important part of the equation here, which is production. What are you getting when these players are on the field, when they're in your starting lineup? I don't think this is a hot take. A healthy Christian McCaffrey is probably going to outscore a healthy Saquon Barkley. The receiving work for him just makes such a tremendous difference. This isn't a talent-based thing at all. I think Barkley is obviously one of the best backs in the league. He plays for the team that I root for, and I really enjoy watching him play. But he does not get targeted the way McCaffrey does. What we saw from Barkley last year was about as pure of a run out, as pure of a season as we could really hope for from Saquon Barkley. He broke off an absurd number of long runs. He racked up humongous volume. He had all these positive game scripts, right? Where the Eagles were always winning. He scored 22.2 points per game, and that's amazing. That's an awesome season. It was still 2.3 points per game worse than McCaffrey's 2023 season. And that wasn't even the best season we've gotten from Christian McCaffrey. So his upside is just as high as Barkley's. I think it's pretty clearly higher even than Saquon Barkley's when he's on the field. But what's the point of this comparison? What am I trying to say? To be clear, because I know people are going to run down to the comments probably before I've even gotten to this point and say, you think McCaffrey's better than Barkley, or you think you should invest in McCaffrey over Barkley. The point here is not that McCaffrey should be valued ahead of Saquon Barkley. I don't even think he should be in the same tier as Barkley. I have Barkley ahead of Christian McCaffrey in my Dynasty rankings because I do recognize that McCaffrey's value is more fragile, that he is at a higher risk of injury. But what I'm highlighting here is a market inefficiency. The gap is too wide because the recency bias here is such a powerful thing, because McCaffrey was hurt last year and Barkley wasn't. But if I'm trying to acquire a post-age apex running back for immediate production, I would rather trade for Christian McCaffrey at his cost than trade for Barkley. That's what I'm getting to here. That's what I mean with the concept of this video. This player at their cost versus another player at their cost. Because you look at the guys that are ranked near Saquon Barkley and Christian McCaffrey. For Barkley, you're passing up on really valuable cornerstone type of assets. Like if you're in a startup scenario, you're talking about Drake London, Drake May, Caleb Williams, Ladd McConkey. You look at the players around Christian McCaffrey, Sam Laporta, T. Higgins, Michael Penix, Kyron Williams. It's a totally different caliber of asset. There are plenty of leagues where you can go and trade your current year first for McCaffrey. You're going to have to pay at least double that for Barkley in almost any league. So that's what I'm trying to highlight here, is that I just think McCaffrey has the better opportunity cost, or I should say the lower opportunity cost, that makes him a more worthwhile investment, even if there is some increased risk with him versus Barkley. All right, for this next pair of players, we're going to do a little blind resume, and all these numbers come from the Fantasy Points data suite, which is something that I use to prepare for basically every video. I also use it when I'm trying to evaluate trade offers or I'm trying to navigate my own dynasty leagues. It's a really helpful resource. You don't have to be a data scientist to use it. I certainly am not one, but it has a ton of advanced metrics for receivers and running backs and quarterbacks, filtering capabilities, things you might not even think of on your own, but it lets you, see how players stack up against each other in really unique ways. So if you're interested in that, you can go to fantasypoints.com/plans and you can use my code PURE10 to get 10% off the Fantasy Points data suite. I definitely recommend checking that out. If you are a real dynasty diehard, if you're in a lot of leagues, you like digging into the metrics, it's a really cool resource. It's become my absolute favorite. But for this comparison of players, okay, player A, wide receiver A, ran 430 routes last year, had a 24% targets per route run, a 23.1% team target share, and a 2.12 yards per route run. Okay, this player played in 12 games. Wide receiver B ran 412 routes, 24% targets per route run, 23.9% team target share, 2.18 yards per route run. This was in 14 games. Now, player A is valued as the wide receiver 18 on Fantasy Calc. Player B is the wide receiver 27 on Fantasy Calc, despite being 2 years younger. Now, if you haven't already guessed who these two players are, I won't blame you. It is T. Higgins and George Pickens. And the big difference between these two players in their production, because obviously Higgins did outscore Pickens by quite a bit last year, and I think the difference in their perception as players really comes down to total volume, total routes run. Because you look back at our earlier comparison between these two guys, all of the per route numbers are incredibly similar, almost identical numbers. But Higgins ran 28 more routes than Pickens in 2 fewer games. He ran almost 36 routes per game versus 29.4 for George Pickens. But here's the thing. George Pickens does not play for the Pittsburgh Steelers anymore. Okay, he's on the Dallas Cowboys, and the Cowboys have attempted 637 and 614 passes over the past 2 years. The Steelers were at 499 and 506. That difference is night and day, and I think this is going to unlock a different level of upside for George Pickens. You look at his 17-game pace last year with the Steelers, 71 catches for 1,093 yards. If we just translate the same targets per out run, the same yards per out run, the same route participation numbers to the Cowboys, but on that level of passing volume, now we're looking at 90 catches for 1,370 yards. Okay, that's a huge difference for fantasy production. The new setup for Pickens is very similar to what we've seen from T. Higgins, where he's in a high passing volume offense. He's got good quarterback play. Not saying that Dak is Joe Burrow, but he is a very capable quarterback when it comes to getting the ball to his receivers. And he's playing alongside an alpha wide receiver one in CeeDee Lamb. I think he has a shot to put up pretty similar numbers to T. Higgins. Okay, as I've pointed out, their peripheral numbers, what they're able to do on a per route basis, was basically identical last year. The difference is the routes, like I said, and then Higgins catching 10 touchdowns in 12 games, while Pickens caught just 3 touchdowns in 14 games. Now, Higgins was way beyond any touchdown production we've seen from him in past years. I think this discrepancy is going to be a lot closer now that Pickens is in Dallas. And I wasn't even the biggest fan of George Pickens when he was coming out, even after his rookie year. But over the last 2 years, he has quietly put up really strong market share numbers, efficiency metrics that have been overlooked because the Steelers just don't throw the ball much and they haven't had good quarterback play. Now, once again, I'm not saying that George Pickens is a more valuable dynasty asset or even equally valuable to T. Higgins. Sure, there is some legitimacy to the idea that he has to actually do it. He has to actually give us those points that do seem very projectable right now. But I do think his value has a lot more room to grow than Higgins. And the best part is that he's a lot easier to acquire right now. I just drafted him at the 701 in a recent startup. And honestly, I'm happy to trade for him in pretty much any league if I can do it without giving up a first round pick. I think he's worth late one value, but I'd like to acquire him without moving a first. That's something I think you can do with George Pickens. That's much, much harder to do if you're trying to get T. Higgins. All right, now let's talk about tight ends, specifically TJ Hawkinson and David Njoku. And this one's a bit of a buy and a sell, because I think Njoku is a really good value right now, regardless of Hawkinson's price. But I want to start with TJ Hawkinson and talk about him a little bit, because he strikes me as a pretty clear sell candidate right now. And we can get into the comparisons with Njoku in a second. But with Hawkinson, he's been in this elite tight end conversation for most of his career because he had the draft capital. He had that year 2 breakout. He's gotten a little better each season, excluding 2024. But I do think that the 2023 season did skew the perception of Hawkinson as a talent. He posted career highs in targets per out run and yards per out run in his first full season with the Vikings. And then late that year, he tore his ACL. So I think the consensus take right now is Hawkinson just wasn't 100% in 2024, but he can get back to those 2023 numbers again, or pretty close to that, in 2025. What I think people kind of fail to remember about that miracle run for Hawkinson in 2023 is that Justin Jefferson missed 8 games that year. It's kind of important thing to remember that the best wide receiver in football was not on the field for 8 of the 15 games that you played. If you look at Hawkinson in just the games that Jefferson was healthy, his targets per out run drops from 0.27 to 0.23. In other words, 23% targets per out run. His yards per out run goes from 2.01 to 1.57. Those numbers are much more in line with the player that we saw in 2021 and 2022. Very similar numbers. And entering 2025, I think that's the Hawkinson we should be expecting. Like, putting aside any kind of lingering doubts we might have about his ACL recovery, he is the 3rd target on his own team. And don't try to tell me he's better than Jordan Addison, because he's not. This is a massive problem for Hawkinson's upside, because basically every elite tight end season we've ever seen has been from a tight end that's top 2 on his team in target share. There's just not enough volume to go around. And this is not exclusively a tight end problem. It's just not good if a player is not a top 2 target on their team, but it especially hurts tight ends because they don't make as many big plays as wide receivers do. Like, you can get by as like a Jameson Williams type if you're going to be catching 50-yard bombs. Hawkinson needs a lot of targets to produce, and there's not enough volume. I went into the Fantasy Points data suite, another plug. I looked at the 3rd highest target share on every single team in the NFL. In 2024, these were the highest target shares for players that were 3rd on their team in target share. And this is excluding partial seasons like Godwin playing 7 games or Rice playing 3 games. Everybody here ran at least 200 routes. So the highest was Rome Odunze at 17.3%. Then we had Deebo Samuel at 17.2%. Sam Laporta at 15.3%, and then Mike Gesicki at 12.6%. Those were really your 4 highest target shares for the third target on an offense. And Hawkinson, if you count him, he was under that 200 route mark, but he did play 10 games. He was at 16%, so he would slide in there between Deebo and Laporta on his 58 total targets that he had in his 10 games. So this is a problem for his upside. Unless there's an injury to Jefferson or Addison, there's just not enough meat on the bone for Hawkinson to put up impactful fantasy production, like real, difference-making production. Can he finish as the tight end 7, the tight end 8? Sure. But that player is not worth a first-round pick. He's not worth being taken in the range that he's going right now in Dynasty startup drafts, what he's being traded for. So that's really the issue that I have. When you look at David Njoku, okay, much cheaper player. He's going, I think, over 3 rounds later than Hawkinson in startup drafts. That's reflected in the fantasy calc ranking. He's just 1 year older. He's 29, Hawkinson's 28, but his per route numbers have been much more impressive. He posted a 21% target share last year, 0.25 targets per route run. Obviously, his offense is going to be worse, but his target competition is a lot worse. Jerry Jeudy earns targets at a rate similar to Jordan Addison. We can call those two pretty much a wash. But let's replace Justin Jefferson in this equation with Cedric Tillman. You see how that might change the numbers a little bit? So Njoku's just going to have a way higher target ceiling, and that's just going to translate to, I think, more fantasy production in the majority of outcomes. Or at least similar production at a much, much lower cost, which either one, either one works for me. Now, David Njoku might not find himself near the end zone very often. That's a fair criticism. The Browns are projected for the least points of any team in the league. But Hawkinson's never been a touchdown scorer either. His career high of 6 touchdowns came back in 2020. He lives on volume just as much as Njoku does. So the fact that Njoku's 30 spots behind him on fantasy calc, consistently goes 3 rounds behind him in startup drafts, he sticks out to me as a much, much better target at cost. And again, let's consider the opportunity cost. At Hawkinson's value, you're looking at guys like Xavier Worthy, RJ Harvey, George Pickens. At Njoku's value, you're looking at like Cortland Sutton, David Montgomery, maybe a Trey Harris. If you're looking at young players going in that range, it's just a much, much easier case for me to sell myself on Njoku as a guy who I think has similar or better upside and a much lower opportunity cost. And I think you can actually make a similar case for Tucker Kraft, who goes really close to Njoku, ranked close to him on fantasy calc. He's also 30 spots behind Hawkinson. Unlike Njoku, we haven't seen that high target earning from Kraft yet, but he's still young. He's going into his second season as the true starter for the Packers, and he made up a lot of ground in the efficiency department. He had 1.9 yards per out run last year, nearly 11 yards per target. He led all tight ends in yards after catch per reception. And I think Tucker Kraft just has a much clearer path to being a top 2 target on his team, which is what we just talked about is really important for upside than Hawkinson does. He's competing with Jaden Reed, who to this point in his career has only been a slot receiver, and rookie Matthew Golden, who was not a volume hog in college whatsoever. So with the Packers that are likely going to regress to a more pass-heavy offense this year, or at least a more balanced offense, I should say, I think we could see a smaller gap in production between Hawkinson and Kraft than a lot of people are expecting. Okay, this next one's going to ruffle some feathers, but let's do another blind resume here, okay? Player A, 27 and a half years old, played in 15 games last year, 21% targets per out run, 1.97 yards per out run, 20.4% team target share, 108 targets, 66 receptions, 992 yards, 12.9 points per game. Player B is 28 years old, played in 15 games last year, 27% targets per out run, 2.47 yards per out run, 22.7% team target share, 108 targets, 77 receptions, 975 yards, 14 fantasy points per game. Which of these 2 guys would you rather have on your fantasy team? Who was the better one to have on your team last year? The 2 players I'm talking about are DK Metcalf and Jawan Jennings. And you might be saying right now, this is ridiculous. These are not comparable players. I hear you. I understand you. I'm not saying these guys are exactly equal, but let's just talk about Metcalf for a second. This is not a matter of just one down year for DK. Okay. In 2023, he also had a lower targets per out run, yards per out run, and target share than 2024 Juwan Jennings. If you go back to 2022, the overall target share was slightly higher, but still less efficient per route than Juwan Jennings was. He has underperformed expectation basically every season since 2020, which was his big year 2 season. I'm not highlighting these numbers, these per route numbers that favor Juwan Jennings, to suggest Jennings is actually a more talented football player than DK Metcalf. That's not what I'm trying to say here. But these metrics, these per route numbers, you might say these are just numbers on a spreadsheet. These metrics are what drive fantasy production, right? A wide receiver gets to run a certain number of routes per game. The more often they command a target and the more efficient they are on those targets, the more fantasy points they're going to score. That's what it comes down to. You throw in a little bit of variance in the touchdown column, but otherwise it comes down to routes and target percentage and yards per route. That's really what it's all about. Now, DK stepping into a new situation where I totally believe that he can and probably will earn targets at a higher rate than he did with the Seahawks because the surrounding competition is worse. Okay, Calvin Austin is not Jackson Smith-Njigba. I understand that. I do have concerns about the passing volume and frankly the quarterback play in Pittsburgh, but I do think that Metcalf is likely to outscore Jennings in 2025 given how their circumstances have changed, right? Metcalf stepping into a situation that's more wide open. Jennings is getting McCaffrey back in his offense. Ayuk's going to come back at some point. Ricky Pearsall's in year 2. I understand there are differences here in the situations. Once again, my point is not that there should be no gap in value between these two guys. It's that the gap is too wide because these two wide receivers are basically the same age. They are in fairly murky situations long term. Jennings needs a new contract. Metcalf has the long-term deal, but he has no quarterback long-term. Rodgers is a one-and-done quarterback. The Steelers are going to be out of position to get an early quarterback next year, and they're going to be right back where they were before they signed Rodgers. That's a problem for him. And the season-long expectations in 2025 for these two are not that different. On Underdog, which is our best proxy for redraft ADP right now, Metcalf is a late 4th-round pick. And Jennings is the first pick of the 6th round. If you look at this screenshot, I know there's a lot of names between these guys, but it's not a big gap in ADP. 44th overall to 61st overall. That's implying at most like a 1 to 2 points per game gap between these players. And yet, if you go over to Fantasy Calc, Metcalf is being valued as the wide receiver 25, while Jennings is all the way down at wide receiver 50. And if you go over to the trade calculator, the implied value gap between these two guys is equal to a 26 second and 3rd. Personally, I'm taking the Jennings side of this trade every time because I just don't think Metcalf's going to provide enough of a boost in production versus Jennings to justify giving up those picks. I'd rather bank the picks and just be fine with a slightly lower scoring wide receiver rather than going all the way up to Metcalf's price, which I do think is a little bit inflated right now. All right, let's wrap this thing up with one more pair of wide receivers. I'm not going to leave you in the dark this time. We're going to talk about Khalil Shakir and Darnell Mooney. Okay, Shakir is 116th overall in Fantasy Calc. Mooney is down at 148th. And just for one more data point, I'm in a startup draft right now. Shakir went 10:03, and Mooney just came off the board at the 13:11. So almost 4 rounds of difference in my startup draft between these two guys. And this gap between Shakir and Mooney feels like a classic case of overvaluing youth. Khalil Shakir is about 2.5 years younger than Mooney. He's 25. Mooney will turn 28 in October. And that gap is worth something for sure, but I don't think we should be overemphasizing that gap when we're talking about replaceable production. These are not star players we're dealing with here, and both of them are still well within their prime. I also think part of the value of Shakir is that people care a bit too much about the playing with Josh Allen thing when Allen's not really a quarterback that's elevating his pass catchers that much. He's obviously one of the best in the league, but he also runs quite a bit, especially near the goal line. He's not like some cheat code for wide receiver production, right? Like Stephon Diggs was awesome with Allen because Stephon Diggs was awesome. We don't just assume that every wide receiver that steps onto the Bills is going to be awesome. The opposite has been true the majority of the time. So I'm not giving him any kind of a Josh Allen bump personally. But Mooney and Shakir gave us very similar production last year. Mooney was at 12.1 points per game. Shakir was at 12.2. So you can't really get much closer than that. And they both had strong peripherals. Shakir was targeted more often per route, but he had half the ADOT of Darnell Mooney, and he ran a lower percentage of the routes overall. Both of them were over 2 yards per out run. And the market does view these players very similarly for 2025. If we look back at the underdog ADP one more time, we've got Khalil Shakir at wide receiver 45, ADP of 80.5 overall. Mooney at wide receiver 47, 86.0 ADP. So they're only going about 6 spots apart. Now, the fact that Underdog is a half PPR site is going to sway this a little bit, with Mooney being more the big play threat and Shakir being more the volume guy. But even in a PPR setting, I do not think that we should be projecting these guys very far apart at all. And unless Shakir can suddenly become a full-time wide receiver in his 4th season, which is something that he couldn't achieve last year, competing against Mac Hollins and Keon Coleman, I do think Mooney actually has a little bit more scoring upside than Shakir, because Shakir in his 70% route share is already being targeted very frequently. 0.27 targets per out run is really, really high. And we can't really project him to improve on that. We can't really project him to improve on 2.27 yards per out run. That's very efficient. We just need him to run more routes. And I don't know if that's going to happen. They replaced Mac Hollins with Josh Palmer, who's probably better, but at the very least an equal player. Keon Coleman's going into year 2. I don't think Shakir's role is really going to change very much. And so in most scenarios, we're going to see Darnell Mooney run a lot more routes than him. And I think with the way that this Falcons offense is shaping up, he has a decent chance to improve on what he did last year. The Falcons didn't add anybody on offense, and I think they could throw a bit more, because the Falcons pass rate, when you take out the weeks that Kirk Cousins was hurt, he got hurt in week 10, and then he was benched after week 15. So you look at weeks 1 through 9, 16 through 18, the Falcons were 14th in neutral script pass rate. So in other words, their tendency to pass in neutral situations, not when they were trailing, not when they were leading, neutral, was higher. It was a good bit higher than the full season sample, including all those Cousins games, because I think they were trying to keep the ball away from him because they knew he was a liability. So I think the passing volume comes up a bit. And then you look at Michael Penix, he could actually be kind of a gold mine for his fantasy producing wide receivers, because he is a total statue. He does not scramble. He also avoids sacks really well. So you have low sack numbers, low scrambles. That means you're going to have more dropbacks turning into pass attempts. I think it was Jacob Sanderson pointing this out on the Dynasty Points podcast. So shout out to him. But that's great. And then he also is a high tendency deep ball passer. He was the 6th highest in deep throw rate last year of any quarterback with 100 or more pass attempts. So it wasn't that small of a sample, right? It was over 100 attempts. He's a big play hunter. He's a gunslinger. He doesn't get sacked. He doesn't scramble. That's kind of the Jameis Winston archetype for fantasy wide receivers. I think it fits Mooney really well. So to me, Mooney feels like a bit of a forgotten man, and this is really more about him than Shakir, but I do think it's nice to compare the two, because Shakir is really viewed as a guy with more brand equity, more value, when in reality, I think they project very similarly. And the nice thing about Mooney is I think you can get him without even having to give up like a 2nd round pick. I think you can give up a 3rd and Jalen McMillan, a 3rd and Rashad Bateman, and you have a decent chance at getting Mooney. That's awesome to me, because he feels like the cheapest available wide receiver that has an easy path to finishing as a top 30 option this year. So not the biggest needle mover, but I do think it's an inefficiency that's worth trying to exploit. Anyway, that's going to do it for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed this player comparison video. I hope you got something out of it. If you enjoy my content, please consider subscribing to the channel to get future Dynasty videos each and every week. It really goes a long way. And if you want even more Dynasty content from me, you can go down to the description, become a YouTube member, and you can get access to weekly live streams here on YouTube, my top 200 Dynasty rankings, as well as private channels in the Pure Potential Discord, where I talk Dynasty, answer questions pretty much all day long. Either way, I'll be back soon with another Dynasty video, and I hope I'll see you then.